Jeremy Bentham was hugely involved in social reform. He was very active in the reform of prisons, hospitals, the poor law, women's rights and decriminalisation of homosexuality. He was instrumental in forming the jury system, postage and all manner of elements of law. He particularly felt that the main aim of human life was to achieve happiness and claimed in an introduction to the principle of morals and legislation that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. The principle of utility or usefulness, then, was to achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. His version of utilitarianism then was act utilitarianism, because it states that this principle of utility should be applied to each and every act performed in each unique situation. Any act at all is justifiable if it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It is important that we understand also that the increase in pleasure or happiness also includes the diminishing of pain or misery. Minimising pain is part and parcel of the process of increasing happiness. Bentham devised the Hedonic Calculus, which he felt should be applied when working out the best act to perform in any given situation. This calculus was supposed to be a mathematical way of establishing the greatest quantity of happiness and the smallest quantity of pain in any given situation. It would be applied to each act individually in order to decide the quantity of pleasure produced. Bentham felt that it was possible to calculate units of pleasure or pain using this calculus. A pleasure unit he called a hedon, a pain unit was called a dolor. The different factors of this calculus were designed to try and cover every angle of how happiness could be achieved. You can use the acronym Dr. Price to try and remember them. However, do not inform the examiner in an essay of this acronym. You'll not get marks for it, and it was not from Bentham. It's simply a way to try and remember all 7 of the criteria. Firstly, duration refers to how long the pleasure or pain lasts. Secondly, remoteness refers to how close in terms of time the happiness is. For example, will it happen now or at some stage in the future? Thirdly, purity means how free from pain the happiness is. Sometimes you might experience pleasure that is tinged with pain, or it might be quite contaminated. Happiness that has no pain attached would be more pure. Fourthly, richness means how likely the happiness is to directly lead to further happiness. So if an act is performed that leads to happiness now, will it lead on to future opportunities for happiness that would not be available if the initial action had not been taken? Next is intensity. This refers to the strength of the sensation of pleasure, how powerfully it is felt. It is likely that some pleasures are mild, whereas others are felt very keenly. The penultimate criteria is certainty. This means how sure we can be that the sensation of happiness will be felt as a result of our action. It might be that the sensation is possible, but not a given. Thus, an act that produces a certain pleasure is more worthwhile than one that produces only a possible pleasure. Finally, the extent of the happiness means how many other people are involved and will experience these sensations too. Is it just going to affect one person or several? I might add a note here that it's a good idea when defining each of these criteria to make sure you have synonyms for these words and don't just repeat the word. For example, certainty, how certain we are it will happen. By repeating the same word, you do not tell the examiner that you understand what the word means. So have a nice definition that includes synonyms and avoids repetition. The hedonic calculus is a quantitative measure. What this means is that it does not matter what type of happiness is produced by any act. All that matters is that happiness is produced. It is the amount or quantity that is so important. As far as Bentham was concerned, all happiness is equal. There is no happiness that is better or more valuable than any other, because of course we cannot judge this. It's going to be different for different people. As far as Bentham was concerned, all happiness was worth the same. It was the amount that was produced that we could calculate. In his words, prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and science of music and poetry. If we were to analyse whether our couple, Peter and Raj, were to be able to engage in a sexual relationship, we should use the hedonic calculus to decide. Since this is act utilitarianism, we can see that we could rely on no past experience, but we must assess this act as a unique one and go through the full assessment for it. Firstly, duration. We can ask, is this encounter a one-night stand, or is it part of a long-term relationship where the couple are likely to have a longer-lasting happiness as a result? It would be more worthwhile if the couple were in a long-term relationship. However, even a one-night stand could achieve some happiness. If we were to judge the remoteness of the pleasure, is it immediate or far away in time? In terms of the act itself, we might say that the pleasure is immediate, and so that would be worth more than pleasure that is distant or in the future. In terms of purity, if the sexual relationship is part of a long-term relationship, we might say it's less likely to be contaminated by pain than if it is part of a one-night stand, because a long-term relationship would be expected to include emotional support and partnership alongside the physical expression of the relationship. In terms of richness, the act will be more likely to lead to further pleasures than if it is part of a long-term relationship, because they'll be able to continue to be together. It can lead to a reinforcing of their emotional bond and to a deeper, more permanent relationship. In terms of the intensity of the happiness gained, it can be argued that there is a strong rather than superficial happiness gained if it is part of a longer-term relationship, whereas we might argue that the strength of the happiness might be less intense if it were a one-night stand. In this case, however, we would still need to recognise the happiness that is gained from that experience. In terms of certainty, there is always a difficulty, because it's always hard to be sure before the event. However, we might say that if both partners are consenting and understand the nature of the encounter, then it is certain that happiness will be gained. If they are in a permanent relationship, then we may be more sure of that happiness because we can see it would enhance their relationship further. Finally, in terms of extent, Bentham might argue that it is no one else's concern but theirs, and thus it affects no one but the consenting adults who are embarking on the sexual relationship. Provided it is a private matter, then no one else need be affected. However, no one is in complete isolation from the rest of society, and it might be that we need to look up how friends and family might be affected by such a decision, if at all. Really, what we can argue here is that unless Peter and Raj actually will somehow prevent happiness or cause suffering through their actions, they are at liberty to do what they want. If Peter had an STI, for example, then he might cause suffering for Raj, which would be fairly certain and contaminate the purity of the happiness. Then we might argue it would be morally unacceptable for the relationship to become sexual unless appropriate barrier methods were used.